Hi, and welcome to the video on experimental research. This is kind of the basic level. The next week's one will be on more complex research designs. So with this, as with all the other ones, I'm just highlighting kind of the major points or the points that I want to discuss. Does not mean the stuff that I skip over is not valid or good information, just to try to make these videos as manageable as possible. Want to make sure just to hit some of the high points. So first and foremost, definition of experiment. So type of study designed specifically to answer the question of whether there is causal relationship between two variables. So again, causal means that one variable is causing a change in another. And we typically break these down into independent variables and dependent variables. Independent variables are the ones that we believe are causing some type of change in the dependent variable. So with an independent variable, it's a thing that the researcher will manipulate or control, which is highlighted down here in a little ways. But ultimately, we're looking at the causal relationship because when we look at correlations, it doesn't get us there, right? So correlations, they showcase relationships. They do not showcase anything to do with causation. And again, we went over this in the correlation unit that you can have third variable problems, directionality problems when it comes to correlation. So experiment kind of supersedes that, and it allows us to actually begin to figure out what causes what. So we have two different types of validities that the book highlights here, internal and external. Internal validity is ultimately where a research is conducted and supports conclusion that the independent variable caused any observed differences in the dependent variable. Thus, experiments are high in internal validity because of the way they are conducted, but the manipulation of the independent variable and the control of extraneous variables provides strong support for causal conclusions. All right, so that's a very textbooky block there that I have highlighted. The idea of an internal validity or internally valid study is that you have the means to control most variables. And what I mean by that is that you have your independent variable, the one that you actually think is responsible for causing changes in your dependent variable. And just to make it a little bit more concrete, I'll use an example from one of the studies that I've done, to where one of my independent variables was attractiveness. So I looked at, does attractiveness impact likelihood of getting a guilty sentence, or sorry, likelihood of getting a guilty vote, likelihood of increasing the severity of the sentence, likelihood of being placed on a sex offender registry. So I developed a newspaper vignette, which is just a story where the defendant sexually assaulted a high school student. And in the newspaper story, I put the photo of the defendant, and that's where the attractiveness stuff would have came into play, right? So my independent variable, in that case, one of them was attractiveness, that I would show a photo of an attractive individual and a photo of a less attractive individual. And my dependent variables were looking at ratings of guilt, we're looking at sentence length and time on the registry, if any. So just again, to kind of make it a little bit more concrete there. So internal validity, if I were to have participants come into the research lab and I made sure that everybody was roughly in the same mood, right? So tried to monitor that to make sure that nobody was extremely happy or extremely sad when they came into the lab, but they were just kind of, average mood. I kept the temperature the same in the lab, so everybody was exposed to the same exact temperature. I made sure everybody came at the same exact time. I made sure that I had snacks available, so that way nobody was taking the study while they were hungry. I made sure that there was beverages available, so nobody was taking it while they were thirsty. Right? All these things could ultimately impact the study If I'm able to control all those things, we say that it has good internal validity, that what you actually meant to manipulate probably was being manipulated as one of the only things. Now, you will always run into other extraneous variables, um, but at the end of the day, hopefully, you've controlled many of them. So that's internal validity. We typically see high internal validity when it's in a research lab because you get to control all of those other things. External validity um, is how well can you generalize the results to people and situations beyond those actually studied. Right? So this typically gets boiled down into, is it being done in the field? So are you actually monitoring people's real behaviors? They don't know that they're part of a study. And so you get to see how are they actually responding to whatever it is that you are throwing out there. So field experiments are conducted entirely outside the laboratory. It does not need to be a full-on field experiment to have high external validity. It is the easiest way to get it for sure, but you can get some external validity within labs, or kind of mix that you have some components in the lab, some components outside the lab. Field experiments entirely outside the lab. And the book goes over a study by Cialdini that was looking at towel reusage in hotels. And ultimately, he manipulated, so his independent variable was the message that was on the card. If you've stayed in a hotel recently, odds are you've noticed somewhere there's a card or a little plaque that talks about towel reusage. And sometimes it's just directions that if you want to reuse a towel, just pick it up. If you want that towel to be washed, leave it on the floor. Others, they are trying to promote you to reuse your towel. And that's what this study was looking at. So one version ultimately just said it's showing respect for the environment to reuse your towel. Another one said that the hotel would donate a portion of the savings to an environmental cause. And the third one was that most hotel guests choose to reuse their towels. So there's three different levels of this independent variable. Independent variable would be the message that customers saw. So we would see one of three. So the result here was that guests who received the message that most hotel guests chose to reuse their towels, reuse their own towels substantially more than guests receiving the other two. So because this was done in the field, there's no reason really to question if we would see the same findings in other hotels in other areas of the country, because the idea here is that it generalizes well to hotels in general, that if you put a message about how other hotel guests reuse their towels, you will likely see an increase in towel reusage. So I mentioned the term manipulate, and what that ultimately means is that you're changing its level systematically so that different groups of participants are exposed to different levels of that variable, or the same group of participants is exposed to different levels at different times. Again, very textbooky highlight there. What it essentially means is, if we go back to the Cialdini study with the towel use. So he manipulated what message everybody saw, right? 1/3 saw just save the environment, 1/3 saw we will donate savings, and 1/3 saw most other hotel guests use this. That was what he had control over. It's what he was changing and altering. And so again, what we'd say there is that there was one independent variable, and that was the message. There were just three different levels of the independent variable. And that was, again, save the environment, we're going to donate to a cause, or other hotel guest reuse. So when we talk about variables and levels, it is different things. Different levels of the independent variable are referred to as conditions. So if you hear conditions, it essentially means levels. So here we had three different conditions, right, of the one independent variable. And again, it's one of those things that as you read more about it, as you just kind of speak it more, it becomes more clear. So if you're kind of confused about one independent variable in that study with three different levels or three different conditions, it will just kind of begin to flow naturally once you start doing research and you start seeing how does everything work. A manipulation check is a fancy tool that we can use to make sure that what it is that we're trying to manipulate actually worked. So when I was talking about the attractiveness photos, well, attractiveness can be subjective. Like we have some things that many people would say are universally attractive, and that has to do with like face structure, so like symmetry and youthfulness. Those things, most people are like, yeah, I'm going to find a symmetric face more attractive than an unsymmetric face or asymmetrical face. And I'm also going to find, somebody that has a more youthful face probably more attractive than somebody that has, a less youthful face. But knowing that, it still doesn't guarantee that my participants are going to view the attractive photo as significantly more attractive than the less attractive photo. So a manipulation check in that instance would just be asking them, how attractive do you find the defendant? And, get an answer. To do it even better, it would be show the photo first, ask how attractive they find them, and then give the story, right? Because as soon as you hear that they're being charged with sexual assault, odds are you're not going to find them as attractive as you did beforehand. So those type of things are really important to keep in mind, because it allows you to eliminate participants from your data set that ultimately the manipulation did not work. Or if you notice the pattern early on, you can adjust without wasting time and money on the participants if you didn't pick good enough photos, or photos of that were extreme enough to get to what it is that you wanted. Extraneous variables, anything that varies in the context of study other than the independent and dependent variables. So here it mentions stuff like writing ability, diet, shoe size. This is going to be for health. Anytime we have a variable in question, we have to recognize that there's going to be extra things that are brought in. How well can we control those extra things? Sometimes we just can't. Sometimes it just is not feasible for us to deal with extraneous variables. Down here, it mentions the idea of mood. And sure, right, like we can try to get people in a happy or sad mood and ask them to do a task, but are we actually fully adjusting their mood? Yes or no? And especially when we're in field studies, it's almost impossible to impact mood, because again, they don't know that they're part of a study. If it's in the lab, you can kind of do a few things to try to keep mood consistent. But even still, you might have somebody that just found out death in the family, somebody who just got proposed to a couple hours ago. There's lots of things that can happen that would adjust mood, so it's hard to get that constant. So it's typically going to be an extraneous variable that, again, you just have to be willing to acknowledge and adapt to the best of your ability to. Here, this is talking about a fictitious study on effects of mood on the number of happy childhood events people are able to recall. And it's really about this table here. So the authors of the text highlight that if you could get a noiseless data set where essentially all your extraneous variables were completely controlled for, here we have people that were in the happy mood condition were able to remember 4 happy memories. People in the sad mood were only able to remember 3. Cool, and that's the same for every single one of them. It's not realistic though. Most data sets look like this, and you can see the means end up being the same, but absolutely, you're gonna have all sorts of weird things going on for any given participant, and weird patterns and trends that will emerge. And that's where again the statistics side come in to try to figure out how do we make sense of all that. And then there's also just gonna be individual differences, right? So like this participant here, ultimately one happy mood, um, and I guess this probably is a between subject, but you have, participant that in happy mood only remembers one. This person, they remember five when they're in the sad mood. It's not predictable, certainly not what the hypothesis would state, and certainly according to the means, not the norm, but you will run into that all the time. So just again, recognizing that this is more likely to happen because you're going to run into things that you just can't control. Confounding variable, an extraneous variable that differs on average across levels of the independent variable. Right, so confounding is the worst one. Extraneous variables, again, we recognize they're going to be there, but a confounding variable is actually messing with your independent variable to a pretty high degree. And this is where IQ gets brought in, that an individual's IQ is likely to have some type of impact on their performance on any given task. So what we don't want to do is try to split people up on their levels of IQ if that's not what we're studying. If we're researching intelligence, absolutely we can split them up based upon their IQs. But if that's not what it is that we're interested in, to then kind of say, well, if those that scored this level, we're going to put them in group A, and if you scored this level, we're going to put you in group B, you are messing up your research significantly at that point. So what we want to do for the most part is rely on something called random sampling, or excuse me, random assignment. I thought it was here, but obviously not. So we'll get to what random assignment is in a little bit. So before we get there, between subject experiment, I know I mentioned this briefly before, but each participant is only tested in one condition. So in my study, I would have participants only read a single newspaper vignette about a single defendant. So it was very much, all right, here's this one condition, and then ask them to rate. And then I would have somebody else come in, look at a different image, same exact story though, and ask them to rate on that, right? So it's between subjects, they were only allowed to be in one condition. There's pros and cons that we'll talk about in this section, but one of the things that we need to make sure happens is random assignment. So random assignment, using a random process to decide which participants are tested in which conditions. So the idea here is that it truly is random. Many times people will kind of confuse what makes something random. And what I mean by that is I've been in different classes that they're like, we're going to assign you to random groups, and they literally have you count off. Right? So I'm a 1 or I'm a 3 or whatever it happens to be, or it will be based upon when you show up for class. All right, well, I'm going to take the first 20 people that showed up today. You're in group 1, the second 20, you're in group 2. But that's not random, right? There's a reason why people are sitting where they're seated, or why they show up when they show up. So we need to make sure that it is truly a random procedure that's being used. Also, people will confuse random assignment with random sampling. I actually made this slip up a little bit earlier. So conceptually, I got the difference down. Word choice, not so much. But random sampling is where you select a sample from a population. And as the text highlights, it's rarely used in psychological research. The reason is that we rely predominantly on something called convenience sampling. That's most of our research is done on college students. So they're done on college students that are at the institute that the primary researcher is at. So we're not really doing a random sample because it's typically from a very specific group to begin with, and we will try to generalize it out to the masses. If we were just to say our population is college students at this particular university, then we would be closer to random sampling. Most of the time, though, they are psychology students, whether they are psychology majors or just students enrolled in psychology class. So we even shorten it up then to that our population, if we're going to do random sampling, is defined as students at this university who are taking a psychology class during this semester or quarter. And it's simply just not broken down that way. So random sampling, again, it's possible certainly to do with psych research. It's just we don't see it often because we rely on convenient samples instead. Random assignment, on the other hand, is what should be done with every single study that's using a between subject design. So again, it just ensures that participants are randomly placed into their different conditions. And with this, it comes with kind of two criteria. One is that the participant has an equal chance being assigned to each condition. So, if you have 4 conditions, they have a 25% chance to be in any given one. If you have 2 conditions, as the example here, they have a 50% chance. The second criteria is that each participant is assigned to a condition independently of other participants. So what that means is that you can't have 2 people show up and you're going to say, all right, you're going to go into A, you're going to go into B because they showed up together, right? You need to make sure that it is independent. And so however you do that is, kind of up to you. Flipping a coin is a possibility. Most of the time we use something called a random number generator, which just you put in how many numbers you want to have randomized, and then you hit go, and then it will spit up a number. So if you have 4 different conditions, maybe you have 3 people show up to a study, you put 1 through 4 in there, you hit go, and whatever number pops up, you put them in that condition. Next person in line, you do the same exact thing. If it's the same one, okay, it's random. If it's a different one, that's fine, put them in a different one, and so on and so forth. So that's one of the ways that we can do it, but we have to make sure it's independent of other participants. So other participants are not factoring in to the placements. We can also do something known as block randomization. So block randomization is essentially something like this, that you have the different conditions, and I would say this is the one personally I use the most, just with the survey tools that I have. But it's the idea that if you have 3 different conditions, your first 3 participants will go into one of them. Now, the placement is random, and the survey software that I use, it does this automatically. It's not perfect. I still will end up with unequal group sizes, but overall, it's trying to do this. But you can see that you have 3 different conditions, A, B, and C. And once you go through them once, you then kind of reset, you go through them again, right? So here we have B, C, A, and you reset, and then you go through it again. And it can maybe even repeat the pattern. So maybe your 10, 11, and 12th participant is CBA again, totally possible. But it's called block because you kind of have blocked your conditions together, just to ensure that you have equal group sizes, which is, again, a statistical assumption that we do our best to meet. And then this is really just kind of vocab heavy stuff. So a treatment, many people hear treatment and they immediately think of the medical type treatments. And it certainly can be, right? The medical community does research in very similar way, but it doesn't always have to be for medical stuff. It can be interventions as well. So improve learning or promote conservation, reduce prejudices. Those are all called interventions. That could also be the treatment. So the way we define it is any intervention meant to change people's behavior for the better. So that is what is meant. So when you read treatment, whether that's in class or throughout the textbook, that is what is meant there. To determine whether a treatment works, participants are randomly assigned to either the treatment condition in which they receive the treatment, could be a drug, but more often than not, it's going to be some type of intervention, or a control condition in which they don't receive anything. With this, it brings up the concerns of something called a placebo effect as well. that you might run into people who just expect to get some type of improvement, so they actually do. So this is where you can do kind of a wide variety of things, and one of them is listed here. That you have your treatment condition, you have the no treatment condition, and you actually inform them that whatever it is that we're doing to this group, we are not doing to you. And then you have a placebo group that you say, all right, we're putting you in the treatment condition, but you're not giving them the actual treatment. You're giving them, a sugar pill if it's a pill, or you're giving them some alternative that is not the thing they're actually testing and should not actually have any effect on the dependent variable. But we may see it because they just are expecting to have some type of improvement. Let's see if there's anything else here. Within subjects. So all that's for between subject design. So again, that's your participant gets exposed to one level or one condition. Within subject is that your participant is tested under all conditions. So as I mentioned before, and ironically, they actually use a similar paradigm for the example here, is that participants shown an attractive defendant and asked to judge his guilt. Another group is shown an unattractive defendant and asked to judge his guilt. And within experiment, the same group of participants would judge the guilt for both an attractive and an unattractive defendant. So what that would mean is that you would read through one newspaper story, you'd see the photo, you would do all the ratings, then you'd read through another one that theoretically is identical, but with a different face, and then you would rate on that photo. So the primary advantage is that it provides maximum control of extraneous participant variables because it's the same participant. So you don't need to worry about maybe one participant is extremely knowledgeable about the criminal justice system, whereas your next participant isn't, right? It shouldn't impact that because the same participant's getting every single level of your independent variable. Now, there is concerns with this. One is a carryover effect, is that ultimately, because they've been exposed to the condition before, and now it's just a variation on it, are they ultimately going to carry over some of the ideas and thoughts they had beforehand, right? So we can have something called a practice effect. That's a carryover effect, where participants just perform a task better in later conditions because they've had a chance to practice it. So this could be something like a memory task or a skill-based task that if you ask them to do something a couple different times under different conditions, you're probably going to see improvement, but it's not based upon the condition anymore. It's just based upon the fact they've done it already or a variation of it already. Another one could be a fatigue effect. So participants perform worse on a task later on just because they become tired or bored. When we run into studies where we're asking participants to do, to take part in it for 2, 3, 4 hours, absolutely, they're just going to stop caring at some point, especially if the compensation is low. Odds are they're just going to begin to perform less. So they're just going to do things to make themselves slightly more entertained, whether that's doodling something or answering in a predictable pattern or whatnot. So that's another possibility here. Counterbalancing is a way that we can try to ensure that participants are, if there are carryover effects, that they're limited, ideally, because in this one, we have 3 different conditions. So the first person is exposed to condition A, B, and then C. Second person might be A, C, B. Third person, B, A, C. Right. So ideally, when we take all the data together, we can kind of eliminate the idea of practice effects because each one is getting a different condition in a different order. So that's known as counterbalancing. There's counterbalancing squares out there that are just kind of fun and kind of shortcuts to figure out where participants should go based upon how many different conditions you have. But again, key takeaway for counterbalancing, it's supposed to reduce order effects and practice effects. And then here, your advantages and disadvantages between subjects. So again, this is where it's just participant is given one condition, have advantage of being conceptually simpler and requiring less testing time per participant. They also avoid carryover effects without the need for counterbalancing. Within subjects, have the advantage of controlling extraneous participant variables, which generally reduces noise in the data and makes it easier to detect a relationship between the IV and DV. So again, both have pros and cons. Some other ones listed here for within is that a pro would be that you typically don't need as much money or resources to give out because you have one person that is doing every single condition. So let's just say you have 4 different conditions. Maybe you need to get 30 data points per condition. Well, with a within subject design, you would only need 30 participants, right? Because they're going to do every single one. With a between subject design, if you have 4 conditions and you need 30 participants in each one, you need 120 participants. So that means that you're going to be paying them, you're going to be paying out more because you need to get more participants. So again, just another pro con. The textbook mentions that if you can conduct a within subject experiment, that probably is the preferred one, because they are weighing the extraneous variables as being like the most problematic thing that you can run into. But again, I think that when you talk to different researchers, they're going to say different things based upon how they were trained. For me, I don't really view one as being truly superior to the other one, or if everything was, an ideal situation, which one would you lean towards? That's just me personally. I've almost always done a between subject experiment. It's just, what made the most sense for the research that I've done. But yeah, I mean, it's as long as you are doing the proper things within either one, whether it's between or within, you're doing well, is my 2 cents on it. And then the last bit, which is again kind of more of the applied stuff, so we're not going to spend a ton of time on it. Several approaches for recruiting participants, right? So how do you actually get participants? There's wide ranges. A lot of universities will actually have a subject pool. So it's a software program that if somebody has ever taken a psychology class, they are ultimately enrolled in it. And then you just send out messages to the pool and you request participants sign up for your study. If you're offering them something, it's a way to kind of attract them. If you don't have that, you can do different social media pushes. So whether that's Twitter or Facebook or whatever social media that people use, you can promote that there, give them a link to the study if it's an online study, or give them a sign-up sheet if it's one that they have to come to the lab, and just recruit participants that way. There's also different programs, for lack of a better term. One is known as Amazon MTurk or Mechanical Turk, which allows you to recruit participants. There's another one called Qualtrics, which allows you to recruit participants. Typically, those you do have to pay for them. If it's a school day subject pool, typically they're just compensated with extra credit. If it's through kind of grassroots like social media, you might not have to compensate them with anything except a thank you at the end of it. But if you're using Qualtrics or MTurk, you have to pay them something. It can range from 10 cents up to a couple $100, depending upon what it is that you're asking them to do. And there's one more thing that I had highlighted. Pilot testing. So a pilot test is where you have all your materials ready to go. You're going to go conduct this research, but before you actually, do the full thing, maybe you do a small scale study where you get 10, 20 participants just to make sure things are working the right way. So you can do this formally. So you can do it from participant pool or social media push or whatnot, or even just friends, family, classmates. because it's not like you're using the data, right? That's the key, is that your pilot data does not actually get used in your study. This is for you to work out all your kinks. So here it mentions things like, do your participants actually understand instructions? Do they understand the materials that you have given? Is the reading level too hard? Do they become bored or frustrated? How long does it actually take for them to complete? Is there a manipulation check there? Does it work the way that you thought it would if you're not using one? Do you have some type of indirect manipulation that you can look for? Do participants know what it is that you're actually trying to get at? It's not if it's yes, you need to change up everything. Just if it's yes, does it impact your study? And if so, then you need to think about alternatives. Computer programs that you have different automated procedures, are they actually working the way that they're supposed to? Is the data being recorded correctly, right? Like all these things are kind of more of the technical things, but making sure that they work appropriately will save you a lot of time and headache and money in the long run. All right, so with that, again, that's kind of your basic overview of experimental research. We're going to do complex designs next week, but if you have any questions about anything that was covered here, do not hesitate to let me know.